I spent the last few weeks digging through satellite manufacturer pricing, launch contracts, and the financial filings of the companies that actually own these things to answer one question: what does it really cost to own a satellite that beams TV signals down to Earth, and does it actually make money? The number to build and launch just one of these is bigger than most people guess, but so is what it earns every single year it stays in orbit. Today, I'm breaking down the real cost, the real revenue, and how this business quietly makes billions. Let's get into it. Let's start with the obvious question. When you watch satellite TV, or when a live sports broadcast gets beamed across the country, there's a physical object sitting 22,000 miles above the Earth making that possible. Someone owns that object. Someone paid to build it, paid to launch it, and now collects money every single day it stays working. So what does that actually cost, and what does it actually earn? First, let's talk about the kind of satellite we're really talking about here. TV broadcast satellites are almost always what's called geostationary satellites, or GEO for short. That means they orbit at exactly the right speed and altitude, about 22,000 miles up, so that they stay fixed over the same spot on Earth at all times. That's important because it means a satellite dish on your roof can point at one fixed spot in the sky and never have to move. This is very different from something like Starlink, where thousands of small satellites orbit close to Earth and move constantly. A TV broadcast satellite is one large, expensive, extremely durable piece of equipment built to stay in exactly one spot for well over a decade. So let's break down the actual cost of getting one of these into orbit. The satellite itself, the physical spacecraft with its solar panels, its transponders, its onboard computers, and everything else needed to receive a signal from the ground and rebroadcast it back down, typically costs somewhere between $150 million and $300 million to build. That's before it ever leaves the factory. Then you have to actually get it into orbit, and that's its own massive expense. Launching a satellite of this size to geostationary orbit typically costs somewhere between $80 million and $130 million, depending on the rocket and the launch provider. Add those two numbers together, and you're already looking at roughly $230 million to $430 million just to build and launch one TV satellite. But it doesn't stop there, because this satellite is about to become a multi-$100 million asset floating in space, with no way to physically repair it if something goes wrong. Owners buy insurance, real insurance, similar in concept to insuring a building, except this building is unreachable the moment it launches. Premiums typically run somewhere between 5% and 20% of the satellite's total insured value. For a $200 million satellite, that can mean $10 million to $40 million in insurance costs alone, usually paid up front before launch. And finally, once it's actually up there and working, you need a ground station to communicate with it, sending commands, monitoring its health, and managing the signal traffic flowing through it. A single ground station can cost anywhere from $1 million to $10 million to build, plus ongoing staffing and maintenance costs every year just to keep the mission running. So when you add it all up, spacecraft, launch, insurance, and ground infrastructure, a single major TV broadcast satellite realistically costs somewhere between $250 million and $450 million before it generates a single dollar in revenue. That's an enormous number. So how does anyone make that money back? This is where the actual business model comes in, and it's simpler than people expect. A TV satellite doesn't make money by broadcasting shows itself. It makes money by renting out space on the satellite to other companies. TV networks, broadcasters, telecom companies, even governments who need to send a signal from one point on Earth to a massive area below. That rented space is measured in units called transponders. Think of a transponder as one channel of capacity on the satellite, capable of carrying a certain amount of data or a certain number of TV channels, depending on how it's compressed. Companies that need to broadcast content don't want to build and launch their own $300 million satellite just to air their channels. So instead, they lease a transponder, or several, from a company that already owns satellite capacity in orbit. It works almost exactly like leasing office space in a building someone else owns and maintains. So what does that lease actually cost? According to recent industry pricing data, the average annual lease price for one standard transponder is trending around $900,000 to $1 million per year, and that number has actually been on a slow decline over the past several years as more satellite capacity has entered the market. In some regions, particularly Western Europe, that price has historically run even higher. Now here's where the math starts to actually make sense. A large GEO broadcast satellite typically carries somewhere between 24 and 48 or more transponders, depending on its size and design. Let's take a satellite with 36 transponders transponders as a realistic middle ground example. If each of those transponders leases for around $1 million a year, that satellite is generating roughly $36 million a year in revenue, just from renting out its capacity to broadcasters and telecom companies. Now stretch that across the satellite's working lifetime. A GEO broadcast satellite is typically built to last somewhere between 15 and 18 years in orbit before it runs low on fuel or its equipment starts to degrade. At $36 million a year over a 15-year lifespan, that single satellite could generate more than $500 million in total lease revenue over its life. Against a build and launch cost of $250 million to $450 million, that's a business that can very realistically pay for itself and then keep generating largely pure profit for years afterward, since the biggest costs, building and launching, are already paid off early on, and the profit margins on this business are genuinely remarkable once a satellite is up and running. Because once it's in orbit and working, the ongoing cost to keep leasing out transponder space is mostly just ground operations and staffing, nowhere near the scale of the original build cost. Industry data on satellite operators shows EBITDA margins, essentially operating profit as a share of revenue, commonly landing in the range of 50% to as high as 75% or 80% for the most efficient operators. That's an extraordinarily high margin for any business, and it's part of why the handful of companies that dominate this industry, names like SES, Intelsat, and Eutelsat, have stayed enormously profitable for decades. SES alone reported more than $1.9 billion in transponder leasing revenue in a single recent year, and that's just one company operating a fleet of satellites, not a single spacecraft. So who actually pays these leases and keeps this revenue flowing? It's a wider list than most people expect. Traditional TV broadcasters, of course, leasing capacity to deliver live channels to homes across an entire continent, but also mobile network operators who use satellite capacity for cellular backhaul in remote areas without ground infrastructure, government agencies who lease dedicated capacity for secure communications, maritime and aviation companies who need connectivity for ships and aircraft far from any cell tower, and broadband providers extending internet access into regions where laying fiber cable isn't realistic. A single satellite in orbit isn't serving one customer, it's often serving dozens of different companies simultaneously, each renting a different slice of its total capacity. Now, before this sounds like a guaranteed money machine, it's worth understanding why this industry is genuinely difficult to break into, and why it's not something a small company can casually get into. First, the upfront capital requirement is enormous. Spending $250 million to $450 million before earning a single dollar back is simply out of reach for all but the largest, most well-funded companies. Banks and investors need serious confidence in a company's track record before financing something like this, which is exactly why this industry has remained dominated by a small handful of major players for decades, rather than being an open market anyone can enter. Second, there's real risk involved that insurance can only partially cover. A rocket launch failure, a satellite malfunction once it's in orbit, or damage from space debris can turn a $250 million investment into a total loss. Insurance premiums exist precisely because these failures do happen, even with the most reliable launch providers and manufacturers in the world. Third, this is a business facing real long-term pricing pressure. Transponder lease prices have been slowly declining over the past several years, driven by more satellites entering orbit and by the rise of newer, cheaper communication technologies. That means the huge margins this industry has enjoyed historically aren't guaranteed to stay exactly this high forever, and companies in this space have to constantly weigh new satellite investments against a market that's slowly getting more competitive. Finally, there's a geography problem money can't fully solve. There are only so many usable orbital slots in geostationary orbit above any given region of Earth, and those slots are allocated and coordinated through international regulatory bodies. You can't simply decide to put a satellite anywhere you want. You need a coordinated slot, regulatory approval, and often years of planning before a satellite even begins construction. So is owning a TV satellite a good business? Based on the real numbers, yes, for the right company, with the right capital, and the patience to wait years for that upfront cost to convert into decades of high-margin recurring revenue. It's not a business built on quick returns. It's a business built on spending an enormous amount of money once, launching a machine no one can physically touch again for 15 years, and then collecting rent from dozens of companies who need what only a handful of businesses on Earth can actually provide. So here's the short version. A single TV broadcast satellite costs roughly $250 million to $450 million to build, launch, and insure. Once in orbit, it earns money by leasing out transponders to broadcasters, telecoms, and governments at around $1 million per transponder per year. Over a 15 to 18 year lifespan, that same satellite can generate $500 million or more in revenue, with profit margins as high as 70 to 80%. It's an expensive business to enter, but for the few companies who can, it's one of the most profitable machines ever launched into space.